Good evening and welcome to the Indiana University's virtual screening room. I'm Brittany Friesner, the cinema's Associate Director. Thank you for joining us tonight for our encore screening of the 2019 documentary Beyond the Visible, HILMA af Klint, directed by Helena Dierschke. This film first screened on March 5th as part of our International Art House series, and we're delighted our film distributor friends Zeitgeist Films and Kino Lorber have made it available for virtual screenings, allowing many more audiences to learn about this brilliant artist. Tonight's film was programmed by Alyssa Brooks, IU Cinema's Outreach and Programming Coordinator and Events and Operations Assistant. Following the film, Alyssa and I will be joined by Mather's Museum Development Assistant, Courtney Kezlarian, for a post-film discussion. I want to extend congratulations to Alyssa, who is graduating this week with her Master's in Arts Administration, as well as congratulations to Courtney, who is finishing up her penultimate semester of a dual MPA and Arts Administration Master's, graduating in December. For them, and certainly all Indiana University students, we know the past few weeks have been an incredible challenge as you've all adapted to a new reality of working and learning. All of us at IU Cinema are proud beyond measure of what our student employees and all IU students have accomplished this year. Congratulations to every single student on every IU campus. We hope everyone is remaining safe and healthy. Please know everyone at IU Cinema misses seeing you walk through our doors and settling in for transformative cinematic experiences. We're so looking forward to hosting you in our space once again, when it is safe. As many of you may know, one of my core values as a programmer is to ensure women's stories are being shared and presented in IU Cinema's program. With the support of women's philanthropy at IU and several programming partners, including the Black Film Center Archive, Themester, and the Asian Culture Center, this past year we committed the entire month of September to films directed by women. We revisited the films of Dorothy Arzner, the first woman admitted into the Directors Guild of America, the short films of pioneering women directors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including Alice Guy Blaché, Zora Neale Hurston, Lois Weber, and Marion Wong. And we hosted several visiting filmmakers in the cinema, including Ash Mayfair, Numa Perrier, Crystal Z. Campbell, Madeline Hunt Ehrlich, and IU alumni Catherine Crump and Riley Dismore. Collaborating on and programming this month-long celebration is one of the highlights of my career, and I want to thank everyone again who participated in our Directed by Women celebration. But let me be clear, IU Cinema is committed to featuring the work of women artists throughout our program all year long. And so it is with great pleasure we present tonight's film, a story told by a woman about a woman who history has tried to forget. And with that, I turn it over to Alyssa to tell you more about tonight's film.
Thank you, Brittany, and good evening, everyone. As Brittany said, my name is Alyssa Brooks, and I'm the Outreach and Programming Coordinator, as well as the Events and Operations Assistant here at IU Cinema. Thank you all for joining us for this encore screening of Beyond the Visible, HILMA af Klint. I curated this film as part of my Outreach and Programming Coordinator internship. As soon as I saw it, I knew it was something special and that I had to use this programming opportunity to share it with as many people as possible. I was so excited to contribute to IU Cinema's longstanding commitment to uplifting the little-known stories of women through history and across disciplines in a meaningful way, and to promoting the work of women directors and writers. Beyond the Visible does both of those things while also examining why women's artistic contributions are overlooked and in need of such intentional consideration in the first place. Before I go any further, I want to say that the first time I gave this introduction in early March, I thanked Brittany Friesner for giving me this amazing opportunity and sharing her programming brilliance through the planning process. And I thanked John Vickers, Jessica Tagg, and everyone at IU Cinema for being so supportive of the event and making my time here as a grad assistant so meaningful, challenging, educational, and fun. I, of course, want to repeat those thanks today, but also to add that I am so grateful for everything IU Cinema has done to help me navigate a very strange and difficult past 2 months. Thank you all for continuing to give me work and new opportunities and something good to focus on. The stability and certainty you've provided have meant so much to me, so thank you for that. Tonight's film, the feature debut of director Helena Dierschke, has been described as a course-correcting work that details not only the life and craft of Hilma af Klint, but also the process of her mischaracterization and erasure by both a patriarchal narrative of artistic progress and capitalistic determination of artistic value. Beyond the Visible tells the story of a woman whose genius existed outside the domain of genius as it was expected to be. Hilma af Klint could not simply pursue her genius. She had to confound society's attempts to suppress it along the way. She was a spiritualist who sought to transcend the realm of men and was convicted in her belief that her work was not of this world. She elected to keep it out of the world as much as possible by forbidding the display of her life's work, over 1,200 paintings and drawings, until 20 years after her death, and insisting it never be sold. This collection remains completely intact and off the market, and it finally exists in a world that's ready for it. The Guggenheim's 2018 exhibition of her work, Paintings for the Future, curated by Tracy Bashkoff, was the museum's most attended exhibition of all time. We are in the future Hilma af Klint painted toward, and I'm so excited that her profound and radiant work can now light up all of our screens. One more thing before I go, please note that there is a brief scene after the credits, so make sure you stick around to see that before you join us again here on Zoom. Thank you all again for joining us, and I'll hand it back to Brittany, who has just a couple quick announcements before we all go watch the film.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you all once again for joining us for this introduction. Please come back if you can for the conversation after the film between Alyssa, Courtney, and myself, which will begin at approximately 8:45 p.m. There will be a countdown on your screen once the introduction ends, so you'll know when to return. At this time, please access the link provided to purchase a rental of the film, which can be found either on our website or on a slide which will appear in just a moment. From all of us at IU Cinema, we wish you continued health, hope, and positivity, and encourage you to support local businesses, arts organizations, and artists when and where you can do so safely. We'll see you back here in a bit, and we hope you enjoy the film.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. As I said before, my name is Alyssa Brooks, and I'm a graduate assistant at IU Cinema, and I'm thrilled again to introduce our two guests, Brittany Friesner, IU Cinema's Associate Director, and Courtney Kezlarian, Art Historian and Arts Administrator. Thank you both for joining us. There you are. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. So the first question that I have for both of you to start us off, I really loved when they were describing people's reactions to the Guggenheim exhibit because that really reflected my initial experience with the film. So I'd love for both of you to talk about your encounters with Hilma af Klint's work. Courtney, I know you saw the actual exhibit, and Brittany, I think you and I both had really similar first experiences with the film. So can each of you tell everyone a little bit about those experiences?
Yeah, who wants to go first?
You go ahead.
Well, I absolutely loved the film, of course, and learning more about her story. I'd first become familiar with her work when the Guggenheim was starting to market the exhibit, and I joked on Twitter that if their tagline for the exhibit wasn't Hilma AF, that I would be disappointed. But that was about all I delved into it. Of the work I saw in the marketing materials, I thought it was beautiful and gorgeous, but nothing hinted at her story. So when I watched this, I basically alternated between, what? Are you kidding me? For the whole 90 minutes, both regarding her genius, but also at what art history has done to sort of squelch her phenomenal and pioneering achievements. And I knew that you were considering programming it for your internship, but after watching it, I was like, you know what? Even if she doesn't pick it, we're going to show this film. So yeah, it was a very wonderful experience, and I'm glad it got to be a part of our program twice now.
Yes, me too. Courtney, what about you?
I remember, because the Guggenheim is not a particularly inexpensive museum. So I was visiting New York, and I specifically designed my trip so that I could go to the Guggenheim on their free Friday. So that I can't remember if it's a free Friday or a free Saturday, but so I sort of orchestrated my trip so that I could go see this exhibition. There was a line out the door, and it was just, I mean, the spiral of the Guggenheim is breathtaking in and of itself, but they did such a wonderful job of sort of using the architecture to weave the story and have this really developmental. You remember from the documentary, they talk about the spiral of being, when you're going out, you're developing, and then when you're going in, you're looking deeper. But it really, it felt almost simultaneous, like you were going on this sort of developing journey of her as an artist, and her in her skill and technique and her work, but also going a lot deeper into how she thought about all of her uh, all of her executions and all of her theories and all of her spiritualism. And then the 10 largest were actually in an alcove to the side before you even started the spiral. And it was almost like it was encompassing. There are quite a few sort of Rothko chapels that are several places in the world where, because they're so massive and colorful and enveloping in nature, they have a lot of them in one big room, so you can kind of feel sort of ensconced in this whole experience of the aesthetic. And that's kind of what it felt like before you went up the spiral. And it was really great. They did a wonderful, wonderful job curating the show. And HILMA af Klint was right. The architecture of the Guggenheim was perfectly suited to her work.
Yeah, that was one of the craziest parts of that movie to me. Every time I see it, I'm just stunned by the way that she kind of foresaw that. Um, so my next question, Courtney, is for you. For those of us who aren't really embedded in the art world, how big a deal have you found that this discovery and rising profile of HILMA af Klint has been? Because it seems like they didn't go really intense about it, but they hinted at a little bit of drama with the MoMA not being really interested in her, and hinting maybe Kandinsky and other people saw her work beforehand, and the conversation of what's worthy of canonization. So what is the uproar that you have seen, and have other similar discoveries and debates taken place recently?
Yeah, I think it actually depends institution to institution. So, the MoMA didn't really, they have a couple listings of her works on their website, but she's not really highlighted in sort of any kind of history of abstraction or anything along those lines of what they publish or the exhibitions that they put on. But the Guggenheim obviously capitalized on her her sort of burgeoning success in Europe as a traveling exhibition, because she was getting so much attendance. But I think that it also is sort of a reflection institutionally in terms of the goals of museums. So there are certain museums that are just, they tend to do more exhibitions focused on bringing to light marginalized voices, marginalized narratives, people taking a certain direction. I mean, the Baltimore Museum of Art in 2020 pledged to only collect female artists for their collection. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has taken a big step institutionally to feature more works that delve into sort of the history of colonization in art museums and those practices. And so I think it's kind of a way for the public to evaluate art museums beyond just, TripAdvisor says it's a great museum. If you see that a museum is really taking the time to highlight these people and to correct their mistakes and to correct the mistakes of art historical academia in general, then that kind of paints a picture of what the mission of that institution is. I mean, MoMA has some catching up to do in more ways than one, in my personal opinion, but yeah.
Yeah. So sort of along the same vein, but for the film world, Brittany, I know from working with you for a few years that you're no stranger to programming films about women's forgotten contributions through history, like Hedy Lamarr and Alice Guy Blaché, and to giving women filmmakers a platform here. So can you tell us about some similarities between Hilma's story and things that have happened in the world of film, or things that you've encountered as a curator of film?
Yeah, we did our first directed by women celebration at the IU Cinema in 2015, inspired by the Directed by Women Worldwide film viewing party founded by Barbara Ann O'Leary, who was IU Cinema's founding social media specialist and blog editor. At that time, it seemed like a huge commitment to dedicate 2 weeks of programming to films directed by women. And by the time we got to the 5-year anniversary last year, it seemed like a month was the bare minimum we could do. I think a lot of what happened in those intervening years were some of the documentaries you mentioned, Be Natural about Alice Guy Blaché, Bombshell about actor and inventor Hedy Lamarr. There were also several film retrospectives around the country, including at IU Cinema, about some of the earliest women filmmakers, including Dorothy Arzner, who, not a lot of people even who study film and media knew about her or knew enough about her. She directed Clara Bow's first talkie in 1929 and is credited with inventing the boom mic. She was a major Hollywood director and writer in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Ida Lupino, who not only acted and directed, but also produced her own films in the 1940s and 50s. So I think, it just sort of started uncovering all at once. And there are certainly multiple examples of trailblazing women who, like I said before, even folks kind of like we saw in the documentary, even folks who study this are flabbergasted to find out the enormous contributions that these women directors made to the history of film. And I just want to give a shout out, if I can, to film distributor Zeitgeist Films, run by Nancy Gerstmann and Emily Russo, for their commitment in acquiring and releasing so many documentaries about these women's histories.
Yeah, so both of you touched on this a little bit already, but just one more before we move on to some questions from the audience. But do you think it's possible to break this cycle of erasure and rediscovering and tokenizing and then forgetting women artists, kind of like they touched on in the film, like we don't want to be fashionable, we want to be a part of art history. So how can the institutions move past trendiness into curating in a holistic, unpatronizing, and permanent way?
Courtney, you want to go first on this one, or I can?
Sure. I think the really important part is the holistic component, in that every sort of entity in the art world has a part to play in correcting what has been established. So art history academia, their role is they really need to start studying and proliferating sort of the establishment of these artists as part of the canon, as part of art movements, as part of technique development, as part of the history that we study. And then museums need to understand that their part is that not only do they need to exhibit women not as just sort of a checked box, but understand that, if you're doing, even if it's not a solo exhibition, if it's just an exhibition or just your permanent galleries, at some point or another, you have bigger exhibitions that can center on you know, HILMA af Klint or Vigie Lebrun or all of these different female artists, but in your permanent galleries, the ones that you sort of just change over every so often, make sure that those also have a lot of female presence in the artists that are represented or what is talked about in the labels. I think that the art market is also incredibly important in understanding how value is accrued to certain artistic names and how, though, you know, the capitalistic, you know, machine that has notoriously undervalued women, not only do you need to correct that, but you also need to make sure that you're featuring them in big auctions and appraising them at the same level that you would men. So I think that everybody has a part to play, and you're not going to get anywhere quickly or anywhere efficiently if you leave anybody out. So as much as people would like to pinpoint it on one area, no one gets anywhere if someone is lagging behind. You're only as strong as your weakest link.
Right.
Yeah, and it's a great question because we all have responsibility for this, not just institutions but audiences. We've received some feedback in the past that some have felt like we've tokenized when we've done our directed by women celebrations. But I see it as a way to concentrate that focus 1 month a year, to then challenge our audiences to notice that we do it throughout the year, to demand it's part of our program, to hold us responsible for making sure that's part of what we do all year round. And part of that, holding ourselves responsible in the past few years, we've developed a lot of programming metrics because it's really easy when you're programming a season to just want to program all the things that are coming out and look interesting. But then when you put all of that together, it's, oh gosh, everything is this side or most of it is this side. So that's something we've done internally to hold ourselves responsible. I can't remember. I think it was maybe last fall or maybe the fall before, but we've started tracking and going back and looking at our past programs and looking at how many F-rated programs, how many films directed by women, written by women have we had in our program, and holding ourselves up to a certain standard as we move forward. And we had a semester last year with 49% of our program was F-rated. So, and that wasn't even intentional. It was sort of, oh, well, we didn't even mean to do it that well. So that was something that definitely, again, holding ourselves responsible, audiences holding us responsible, but also audiences holding themselves responsible. We've put on a lot of programs in the last few years that, frankly, I was disappointed more people didn't show up. We did an Ida Lupino retrospective, a Dorothy Arzner retrospective, brought in prints from around the world, archival prints of films you can't see anywhere else. And we still only brought in audiences of 20 to 30 people. So again, I think it's all of us are responsible, institutions as well as patrons, holding institutions responsible, and patrons themselves going out and seeking this type of programming when it's offered, or it could go away. I mean, there is, again, touching on what Courtney said, there is some capitalistic nature to art. And if people aren't showing up for things, you can only do so much of that and still maintain your nonprofit organization. So.
Right. Well, let's go to a few questions from the audience. The first one is, where are HILMA's works now? Are they still on exhibition?
They're all owned by her family foundation in Sweden. That was sort of her desire to have them all in one place, which is remarkable for 1,500 paintings and then 25,000 pages of written documentation of her life. That is impressive. But I don't think that they're being obviously they're not being exhibitioned anywhere right now. But in terms of before this all happened, I don't think that I don't think that they're established in any permanent collections right now as loans. I'm not sure.
I remember looking up this on Wikipedia after we showed it on March 5th, and I believe there are plans to build a museum. There's a foundation. I don't know if it's her foundation or a Swedish Cultural Foundation, but there are plans to build exactly the building she envisioned, and have all of her works in one space. I'm sure that's being put on hold right now, but I do remember
Right.
reading that on the Wikipedia entry.
Oh wow, that'll be beautiful. Yeah, I think there was meant to be, they were meant to be at that Swedish Museum. It touched on a little bit in the documentary who kind of initially rejected her. They were gonna exhibit some of it this spring, because I remember thinking, oh, I wish I could go to Sweden this spring, but I assume that that has been put on pause or changed as well. So yeah, I think things are happening. Okay, another question. Can you speak more about the male-dominated visual art world that kept Hilma's works a secret? What are some other examples of this happening to women in visual art?
I mean, it happens all the time. I mean, I think that you could pretty much take any industry and then think about, I mean, so many marginalized communities that are just excluded, and systematically so. But the ones that I can think of, so it actually happened quite a bit in the 20th century, or the mid 20th century, during sort of the postmodern movement. A really great book, if anyone is interested in learning about women that were kind of sort of subjugated by not only the male dominated art world, but their partners who were also in the art world, is 9 women artists. I can't remember exactly. It's 9 artists something, and it's about Lee Krasner. It's about all of these really amazing artists and how they sort of had to navigate this world where, because there's not only the systemic, you know, women couldn't have their own credit cards until the later 20th century. There's a lot of official systemic, but sort of subjugation, but there's also the idea that, you know, these social expectations that, you know, there's nothing concrete, there's nothing in writing that says it, but there's just some kind of air of expectation that, you know, Hilma af Klint was not expected to be an artist, and for long she was expected to be an artist until she was married. And that's just sort of, it's just those simple questions where you ask, would you ask that of her male counterpart? Like, would you pose that? And it's such an easy question to ask, and it's a great way to sort of check yourself in an everyday environment, but also when you read something in history, and just think, like, would that be expected of that person if they were in a privileged class of people? Just kind of,
Yeah. Another one just came in. So how do you see Hilma's spiritualism exhibited in her works? Were there a lot of telltale signs of spiritualism in artworks of that time?
So her spiritualism, I think often it was as theosophy, and just sort of that era of discovery where everyone was just realizing that the world was so much more unknown than we ever thought it was before. I think spiritualism and science really had this wonderful intermingling time where we don't necessarily see that as much nowadays, at this sort of spiritual aspect to science. And I think that, you know, she really represented this idea of discovery and joy in science that people don't really experience as often anymore. I love the I can't remember his official name, but the man who made the last comment after the credits, and just this wonderful German scientist who was just so excited that somebody thought so many wonderful things about science in such a, you know, a meaningful way in their spirit, as Hilma af Klint did. And spiritualism was really popular in abstract artists. Pete Mondrian, Vasily Kandinsky. Kandinsky wrote a book about spiritualism in his own work, and I think because theosophy was so popular during that time, I think everybody was, it was a time for searching for answers, and nobody really discriminated on where those answers could be found. which is kind of inspiring. Of just, we'll take some answers from science, we'll take some answers from spiritualism, we'll take some answers from art, we'll take some answers from, so I think it was an environment that encouraged that kind of curiosity and was popular in that movement.
Right. And I have kind of a follow-up to that. 1 second. Do you feel like part of the reason that she would have kept her stuff so close to her chest for so long? I mean, I know Steiner kind of put her down and maybe hurt her confidence a little, but do you think part of that was sort of protective because of the way people historically have acted toward women, like in a suspicious manner in regards to their religious affiliations?
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, everyone is familiar with, or many people are familiar with the idea of sort of women being put on trial for witchcraft, for their personal practices. There's an established history of when the medical community was coming about to establishing all of these very invasive, like aggressive practices for healing. Women were not feeling it. They did not really appreciate all of the really invasive practicings of medicine. So they had more holistic medicinal cures, and they were persecuted for that. They were accused of being witches for practicing those, when they were really just trying to create healing practices that made them more comfortable and didn't and that they could have control over, and that they could practice in their own house. I mean, I don't know if there's any official record of it, but I mean, there's always the possibility of that.
Right. So we have time for just a couple more. So someone's asking about how her paintings can't be sold. So does that mean the foundation can't sell them as a demand of her will? And it's interesting to see her work being commercialized as coffee mugs and bedspreads, despite this comment. Yes, I've seen a lot of such things, like dresses and things like that, where her work is screen printed on there. So yeah, that balance of her work being off the market, but then sort of the capitalization of it anyway.
I think that the reason she didn't really want anything to be sold is because she didn't want the collection fragmented. She didn't want it in a bunch of different locations, because it is so evolutionary. Like I mean, if you notice when they would do clips of, like the swan, of just how, it got, there was somewhat realistic in the beginning, impressionistic of the two swans, but by the end it was totally geometric, totally abstracted, and just sort of the idea that if you fragmented that, even just that series, it would remove the ability to present it in its totality, which would remove some of the meaning. And I think that she was very deliberate and very smart and very conscientious of the way that she wanted the world to experience her work. And she wasn't really concerned about making money. She wasn't really concerned about, being the most famous. She wasn't concerned with a lot of the status related accomplishment that can come from displaying art. She just wanted the right audience to be able to appreciate what she created. And I think that more than anything is behind, I think that's more behind it, which is to say that, if you are an artist that doesn't value, commercialization, you are at an immediate disadvantage in the current system that we have. So if you don't really if you are not setting up your art to be ideal for the auction house or ideal for the art marketplace, you're immediately at a disadvantage, not just for making money, but for being established in the canon. And that sort of capitalistic connection removes a lot of people from consideration, which is not, in my opinion, valuable.
And it's funny because I would say in film, we're starting to see a lot of people take the reins of their own work and distributing their own work. And I've seen it be a disadvantage, but also an advantage. Someone who has, Numa Perrier is a great example, I think, of, she got her feature film debut in Jezebel into South by Southwest last year. And kind of like Ava DuVernay, she just knew how to market herself and she hit the pavement herself. And now Array now, which is Ava DuVernay's distribution arm, has picked her up. But a lot of the first year really of that Jezebel momentum was because Numa retained the rights herself. She retained her vision and she was not going to let anyone else represent her. So I can see it going both ways. So I'm really excited to see a lot more, especially women directors, taking control of their own destiny. When they can, and when it doesn't when it's not to their complete detriment.
So one more from the audience that I'm going to add my own question on to the end of as well. So what do you think we can learn to make sure that people like Hilma aren't missed in the future? And I would add to that, can you tell us about another artist or filmmaker who maybe won't ever have a documentary made about them, but who you find inspiring that we should all look into ourselves?
You can go ahead.
I was gonna say, I can answer the second part for sure. I'd go with either Dorothy Arzner or Ida Lupina. Perhaps Dorothy Arzner because she was not the first. That was Alice Guy. But Dorothy Arzner was really her own person, and she was in Hollywood at a time. The conversion from talkies to from silent to talkies. But she did her own thing. She didn't try to conform to anything. And she was, I think, the most prolific Hollywood director of the 1940s in the major Hollywood studio system. So she might be someone who gets a documentary eventually. But we just did a 5x series retrospective of her last fall. And a lot of her work that's most popular is pre-code works. I can't believe half of what she got away with, but I'm so happy she did. Her films were just knee slapping, but she also launched the careers of Lucille Ball, Katharine Hepburn, Joan Crawford, so it wasn't just that she was doing her own work. She was also elevating the work of other women artists. So she would be my pick.
Yeah. Courtney?
In regards to what we can learn is, first of all, just, again, make sure that if you are a player in how these stories are presented to the world, then make sure that you're doing your part to really interrogate your choices. I mean, this documentary was wonderful, but the idea that Hilma af Klint was the first person to make an abstract work of art in 1906 is flawed, because there are, whole art practices in the continent of Africa and indigenous communities in the Native American canon that they've all just been doing abstractive Aboriginal sand paintings and bark paintings and all of these really wonderful, rich visual culture practices from other places. They've been going on for hundreds of years. So Hilma af Klint was probably the first European white person to have explored abstraction as to what we've known. But just the idea that you're interrogating your choices on multiple levels, which means that you're thinking more critically, which means that your product is going to be better anyway. And so we always want to be looking and thinking more critically, because that's the sign of a better scholar, a better academic, a better programmer, a better curator. In terms of, I don't think that she'll ever get a documentary, just because her work is a little more, it's less punchy than a lot of af Klint's work. But Maria Sabia Mejian, who was mentioned in that list, that big sort of collage of names, I did my final paper of my bachelor's degree on her, and she is just this remarkable sort of proto-feminist figure in German and Dutch 17th century and early 18th century botanical and entomological illustrations. So she was the first person that ever represented insects on their food plants and then entirely in their life cycle on one plate. She got divorced and fled a religious cult and took her daughter to Suriname for this really big adventure later on in her life, and collected all of these wonderful specimens and documented all of these really interesting created all of these wonderful drawings of flora and fauna of the area. Her whole story is kind of revolutionary. So actually, I would love like a feature film about her, you know,
Yeah.
like the adventures of Maria Sabia Marian. But I don't know who exactly would fund. I don't know how film works. I think Brittany should.
I'll get to work on that.
Thank you.
I
would really appreciate that. I would go see that. I think there was a movie, Tulip Fever, a long time ago that was like the most failed movie I'd ever seen. It got like a 9% on Rotten Tomatoes, but it was about 17th century Dutch portraiture. Like that was some way in the plot. And I just remember going in that movie and I was like, I don't know what anyone is talking about. That was a remarkable movie. So you can just make that movie for me. That would be great.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing that. It's time for us to wrap up, but again, thank you for your insights, and thank you everyone for joining us and sending such wonderful questions. But before we go, Brittany just has a few more closing comments.
Thank you, Alyssa, for moderating tonight's Q&A, and to both you and Courtney for a wonderful conversation. I'd like to give a huge thank you to the entire IU Cinema team for week after week putting on these virtual events, which are quite a production. And I'm going to name every single one of you. Thank you, John, Jessica, Barbara, Seth, Alyssa, Elizabeth, Michaela, Kyle, Carla, Ava, Will, Gabe, Peyton, Mary, and Piyush. Pretty sure I got everybody. I'm sorry if I missed you. Starting tomorrow, we'll have 2 new programs available in our virtual screening room. It's KidFlix 1 and KidFlix 2, which are a collection of short films from the New York International Children's Film Festival. And then next week, on Thursday, May 14th, we are delighted to be hosting, writer-director and IU alumna Eliza Hittman. We'll be having an interactive conversation with her, co-moderated by our founding director, John Vickers, and Union Board Films co-director, Lauren Long. So we hope we'll see you again back next week. Thank you for joining us this evening, and have a great evening.